Throughout history, circumstances arise that allow great men to achieve great accomplishments. Martin Luther was one of those men. Luther lived during a time when the oppression of the Roman Catholic Church was at its pinnacle. Leaders used political positions and religious approval to gain support for future aspirations. The social climate was desperate for change. It would take one man to start the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther. Content of the presentation: early life, education, writings, repercussions of the diet of worms, social reform, later life, impact on culture. Martin Luther was born on November 10, 1483 in Etzbin, Germany. Martin was baptized in the Roman Catholic Church of St. Peter. Shortly after his birth, the Luthers moved to the town of Mansfield. Luther's father, Hans Luther, was a peasant who prospered as a copper smelter. His mother was Marguerite Luther. Luther's parents wanted the best for Martin. They were strict disciplinarians. It is believed that Martin's life was influenced by his constant search for approval and his fear of punishment. Martin Luther began his education in a Latin school in Mansfield in 1488. In 1497, Luther attended a school operated by the Brethren of the Common Life in Magdeburg. His studies on piety at Magdeburg would influence the rest of his life. Adhering to his father's wishes to become a lawyer, in 1501, Martin transferred to the University of Erfurt, where he received a bachelorette degree in 1502 and was awarded his master's degree in 1505. Later, in 1505, Luther was caught in a lightning storm near the village of Stroutenberg. The intensity of the storm frightened Luther. Luther vowed to God that he would become a monk if he survived. In July of 1505, Luther entered the monastery in Erfurt, the order of the Hermits of St. Augustine. Luther had abandoned his study of law. The monastery at Erfurt was recognized as a strict observant faction. Luther thrived on the discipline and rituals of monastery life. His acts of devotion were at times unhealthy. Sleeping in the cold and lengthy fast were commonplace. Luther's need for approval was now focused on a higher source. In the fall of 1508, Luther transferred to the monastery at Wittenberg. During his time at Wittenberg, he received his bachelorette in Bible studies. He also received the theological degree of Bacheloratus Centarius. The latter degree would allow him to teach. Between the fall of 1510 and the spring of 1511, Martin made a pilgrimage to Rome to represent the observant German Augustinian monasteries. While in Rome, Luther visited the remains of the saints and the grandiose cathedrals of the Roman Catholic Church. He noted a profound discrepancy in the wealth of the church and the collection of money from the peasants. The pilgrimage exposed Luther to the lack of spirituality and the political nature of the church's influence. Luther returned to the Wittenberg monastery to continue his studies. He received his doctorate in the fall of 1512 and assumed the professorship in biblical studies. Influenced by his pilgrimage to Rome, he began to publish theological writings. The introduction to the printing press provided Luther with access to documents for study and an outlet for his writings. While at Wittenberg, Luther wrote his pivotal 95 Theses. The 95 Theses were a scathing rebuke of the policies of the Roman Catholic Church. The focus of the document was the primacy of the Bible. The primacy of the Bible meant the teachings of the Bible were to come before the teachings of the Church. Luther's notion that salvation was acquired by faith opposed the Church's sale of indulgences. On October 31st, 1517, Luther nailed his 95 Theses on the church door at Wittenberg. Nailing notices to church doors were not uncommon at the time. The content of the 95 Theses proved to be an exception. Religious leaders from the Roman Catholic Church were enraged. On November 9, 1518, Pope Leo X issued a bull, meaning Luther was to be seized and brought before the council. Pope Leo declared that Luther's views were in conflict with the teachings of the Church. Luther was aware that he had been condemned by the Pope and for the most part abstained from public debates. On June 15, 1520, Leo issued a bull which charged Luther's writings were heretical. Luther was given 60 days after receiving the bull to recant and another 60 days to report to Rome. 120 days later, on December 10, 1520, Luther responded by burning the bull in a bonfire. On January 3, 1521, Luther was formally declared a heretic. Historically, heretics were put to death by burning or drowning. King Charles V of Germany was concerned the rights of a German citizen might have been violated. King Charles had been advised the German estates refused to support the declaration of heresy. Due to Luther's popularity with the commoners, and in the best interest of the Church, it was best to have a formal hearing. If Luther agreed to recant, the threat of heresy would have been removed. On April 17, 1521, Luther appeared before the Diet of Worms. The definition of diet in this case is an assembly of the authorities. Luther was asked to verify his writings. Luther was then asked to recant his writings. Luther responded, "Here I stand. I can do no other. God help me. Amen." Unsuccessful pleas for Luther to recant continued in the days that followed. On April 26, 1521, Luther hurriedly left Worms. On May 18, 1521, Charles drew up papers against Luther. His journey back to Wittenberg, Luther was kidnapped by territorial leader, the Elector Frederick III of Saxony. Luther was secretly taken to Wartburg Castle. Frederick had intervened on Luther's behalf previously in his dealings with Cardinal Cajetan. Frederick helped Luther not because he supported Luther's teachings. Frederick believed it was his duty as a prince to ensure Luther was treated fairly. Frederick knew of Luther's popularity with the commoners. While at Wartburg Castle, Luther began translating the New Testament into the German vernacular. Bibles of the time were written in Greek, making the message unattainable to common people. Luther's translation supported his insistence the Bible is the source of all Christian truth. Luther's decision to translate the New Testament reflects his commonality with the message of salvation by faith. In March of 1522, Luther returned to Wittenberg. The efforts of the Roman Catholic Church to suppress Luther and his followers had failed. The strength of the movement was growing. The riots and protests threatened the stability of law and order. Luther believed in the conservative notion change should not be in haste. Reform became a legal and political struggle rather than a theological reform. By the spring of 1525, the rebellion known as the Peasants' War had spread to much of Germany. Reformer Ralph Munzer had published their grievances in a manifesto entitled The 12 Articles of the Peasants. Luther responded by writing Admonition to Peace concerning the 12 Articles of Peasants, which expressed sympathy for the peasants. Luther also wrote Against the murderous and robbing hordes of the peasants, which denounced the peasants. On June 13, 1525, Luther married Catherine of Bora. The Luthers had 5 children, Johannes, Magdalene, Martin, Paul, and Marguerite. Luther's daughter Magdalene died in his arms in September of 1542. Luther's letters indicate he had a warm relationship with his children and wife. Luther was not the first reformer to marry. His friends and supporters were dismayed at the timing. Luther continued to lecture on the book of Genesis from 1535 to 1545. Luther became cynical and outspoken against Anabaptists, the Pope, and Jews. Peers blamed Luther's cynicism on his deteriorating health, chronic pain, and other physical issues attributed to his early years in the monastery. Luther died February 18, 1546. He is interred at the Castle Church at Wittenberg. Luther's impact on culture include teaching the primacy of the Bible, which led to salvation by faith, which ended the practice of selling indulgences. His translation of the New Testament led to the availability of the Bible for the common people. Luther also composed hymns and established schools. His advancements in theology led to the formation of the Protestant section. The effectiveness of Martin Luther's teachings were influenced by personal devotion, social climate, religious leaders, political ambitions, and the availability of printed media. Martin Luther's impact on culture extends outside its obvious religious implications.